Professor Bates, where does the title come from?
Oh, that's a little funny. When I was a child, there used to be an advertisement, "Better living through chemistry." This is how plastics can make for a better life. There was also a General Electric, which made dishwashers and washing machines. Better living through General Electric. So there's a little bit of a joke there. Literature can make your lives better in the way that, I don't know, plastic can make your lives better. So it's meant to be fun, but I don't know how well it translates into Slovenian.
Okay, well, it's a very interesting, the origin is very interesting, to be quite honest. Would you say that your book, Better Living Through Literature, is then some kind of manual or kind of book of life coaching, maybe as in the case of Alain de Botton's book, How Proust Can Change Your Life?
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting because the challenge, as you well know, in this age of, as we move to the internet and as literature sometimes gets pushed to the side or not taken as seriously, and that's certainly true in the United States, maybe true to Slovenia as well, it's almost as though as literature teachers we have to fight to keep literature center and fight to keep it relevant. And so in some ways, as a literature professor, I'm always trying to make a case for literature. And this was a way of, for those people who think that literature is just on the fringes or just a frivolous pursuit or something entertaining but not central, this was my attempt to make the case that literature has always been and continues to be central to our lives.
Okay, thank you. This is certainly the case, and this just reminds me of Horace's Dulce et Utile.
Oh,
so
yes.
it is definitely not just entertainment,
Right.
but also
something
powerful and relevant, and something that has an impact on our lives and history, as you mentioned in here. You start with the classics. You refer to Aristotle and Socrates, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, there is this question very central at the beginning of your book, in the introductory part, which I think is also very, very telling and very concise. It's about mimesis, it's about literary immersion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the relationship between art and life. Why are or have been people over history afraid of this immersion and mimetic, mimesis? Mm-hmm. So maybe getting lost in fiction, identified with fiction or characters and so on. So from the antiquity onwards, this has been an ongoing issue. What would you have to say about this?
It's kind of funny because I begin the book with Plato, and it's kind of funny because Plato is famous for his attack on Homer, on Hesiod. Plato said, when Plato sets up his ideal republic, he bans poets because he's afraid that people, when they read or when they listen to, often they would hear it in recitation, but when they encountered passages from the Iliad or from the Odyssey, they would be corrupted by those. The young man would encounter the passage where Odysseus goes into the underworld, and it was so horrifying in Plato's mind that they would become afraid of death and they would run away in battle. So he thought their emotions would be so swayed that it would corrupt them, and so he just wanted literature that only celebrated the state.
So that it would be beneficial for the republic, for the state, right?
But
so they feared this.
Yeah, of course, Plato was so afraid, and of course he had seen demagogues, lead to the death of his beloved tutor, Socrates. So he had seen the power of emotions being able to override reason. And so he had some of the same concerns about literature. Literature is so powerful that it will override reason and therefore should be banished from his rational republic.
Right, okay. Yes, well, you certainly give a lot of examples later on from the century. I mean, later on from 17th century onwards, actually. Well, even Shakespeare is, I think, mentioned.
Right.
Actually, you mentioned Othello as a kind of very powerful, powerful kind of dynamiting.
Right.
Would you?
Of course, right.
No, it's close to me, close to my heart.
Of course, actually. I know you teach Othello.
Right.
Actually, my mention of Othello is that sometimes teachers think that they are, contemporary. As you may know, there's a kind of an epidemic of book banning going on in the United States right now. For the most part, people think that, well, they're not banning Shakespeare, but there are on the same grounds that some people are banning other books, they could also ban Shakespeare, because issues of race are so potent and so dangerous, at least as in the eyes of certain Americans right now, that the powerful way that Othello explores issues of race and power and interracial relationships.
Right.
So it's interesting. I used to think that, well, they won't ban Shakespeare. Shakespeare's safe. But there's a Florida school district which banned Romeo and Juliet. There's a New Hampshire school district which banned Twelfth Night. And so I do a kind of thought experiment. If teachers really showed how powerful Othello is, Othello might get banned in any number of American schools as well. So
hopefully not. But
hopefully not.
So
right.
it's about banning books, but also censorship in a way, indirectly. Could you give us some example of this?
Of books that are being censored?
Censored also, yeah. Not just banning, but it's...
Yes. Toni Morrison, of course, the Nobel Prize-winning author, has been banned throughout in so many schools and so many libraries throughout the United States because, in The Bluest Eye, she talks about, the rape of a child. In Beloved, she talks about, the rape of a slave, who then kills one of her children rather than become enslaved again. And these books, her books have sometimes shown up in political campaigns. People have, the governor of Virginia a number of years back said this boy in high school was corrupted or was bothered by Beloved, and he won the governorship, not only for that, but that was part of his campaign.
Really?
So, but it makes sense because when Beloved touches on two of the most fractious events in American politics right now, which is race and a woman's autonomy over her own body. And so when you teach this novel, you confront these issues, and your minds can be changed. And certainly these right-wing groups who are banning this are afraid that minds will be changed if their children, if their teenagers read them. And so there's the same kind of fear that Plato had about Homer or Hesiod corrupting young men. Parents today sometimes feel that Toni Morrison will have the same effect on their own children.
Okay. It just goes to show how powerful literature can be, but also is people know it has this power.
Right.
So that's why the banning and censorship, etc. You actually start your book with a reference to two real life, experience of prisoners actually. One was abducted. So Barud and Chamlia, right? So young people who have been, suffered from this. So why have you chosen these two examples?
I thought because it's just, I just found these two very compelling examples. Yeah, one is the example of he was a Somali doctor.
Barud, this would be Barud,
right.
Yes?
Yeah, a Somali doctor who, he saw some problems in his hospital. He thought if he wrote to the authorities and told them about these problems, they would come in and perhaps fix the problems. Instead, what they saw was an independent man that they didn't want anywhere near the hospital, and so they put him in jail, solitary confinement, and yeah, it was just a nightmare, of course.
Of course.
And but his the prisoner in the cell next to him had gotten a hold of a copy of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's novel, and through a series of taps, he tapped out the entire text of Anna Karenina. Of course, it's, I don't know, what, 500, 600 pages? and Barud, the doctor, said it saved his life. But what's interesting to me is how he used Anna Karenina to hold on to his sanity. He was able to kind of imagine he was angry with his wife for not coming to visit him, even though she was not allowed to visit him, and so he identified with Anna, who's so upset with Vronsky for not visiting her, for abandoning her. At any rate, it's an example of how we take these powerful stories and then we process our lives, wherever our lives are, through them, and sometimes they can give us hope in the most desperate of circumstances. Mm-hmm. I mean, and of course, from the point of view of the Somali authorities, it's almost like they don't want an independent thinker. That's why they put him into jail in the first place. But through the power of the imagination, you discover who you are, what you think, and so it's almost like literature is automatically, by its very definition, literature it's like gunpowder. It's like it's like it's explosive.
Potentially, well,
you can't control what a reader is going to do when that reader encounters a work of literature.
Right. So that is, of course, an actual case study. Well, study, an actual real life story. Well, narrative.
Right.
Of course, we all need narratives. To live life. Yeah.
I love what I call them reading stories.
Okay.
My entire life, since I was a kid, I used to ask people, "What's your favorite book? What's the book you like?" And I was fascinated by the different responses. So when I became a teacher, I just started collecting every reading story I could, and then I go back into history, and I say, well, why was Plato so fascinated with the Homer? Why does Aristotle feel this catharsis when he watches a performance of Oedipus? And so I'm constantly looking, not only with my students, with my friends, with my acquaintances, but throughout history, why have people had the reading experiences that they've had, and why do they, what has been powerful about those reading experiences?
You touch upon the culture wars as well,
yes,
right? And the literary canon. So could you maybe say which book you think was very instrumental in this?
In my own development?
In your own
development. Sure.
Yeah.
There's one book above all that stands out. So,
since we're talking about personal preferences,
right, I'm asking you. I'd be glad to. Yes. So I was born in 1951. So I was raised in Tennessee, and when I was a child, of course, segregation. Blacks went to one school, whites went to another school. We lived in an unequal society. But my parents were very liberal, and so when I was 10 years old, my parents got together with some black parents, and so there were 4 black families, 4 white families. This was the only place in the entire South where this happened, but they came together and they sued the local school board to try to...
If I may interrupt you, I think your father was a professor of French.
Professor of French, right, that's right.
I remember him well. So,
that's right, yeah. So
they sued the
school board because this was in 1960, but in 1954, the Supreme Court had outlawed segregation, but there were still schools which were still segregated, even 7 years later. And so we sued, the school board to integrate. But of course, as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old child, I received a lot of hatred from my fellow classmates. And of course, I was living in an environment where I'd seen segregation my entire life. But my father read to me, and my brothers, Huckleberry Finn. And there's that one scene, it's the most famous scene in Huckleberry Finn, where he has, well, do I go and rescue, Jim, his friend, has been, back in captivity, and so says, well, if I go and rescue Jim, I'll go to hell. But his friendship is more important than what society deems as correct. And so he says, okay, I'll go to hell, I'll go and rescue my friend. And that was so important for me at 11, because it's like, it doesn't matter what all the society around me is saying. If there's that friendship was more important than what all these racists were saying. And so I didn't feel I was alone. And so we won our...
You were able to identify.
Yeah, totally. I was Huck at that moment.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so when we won our suit. It was a landmark. It was an important suit. And Ronnie Staten was the first African American kid in my class. And because I had that, I reached out to make him feel welcome when he came to our class. He was the only black kid that year. The following year, the two schools merged. But the first year, they just had 1 or 2 black kids in each class. So he was all alone in that class. But I had read Huckleberry Finn, so I knew that it was a way of not only making me feel not alone, but also leading to action, which would help me help somebody else.
Right. And then, of course, this was a kind of transitionary period between the segregation period and then when you said they merged. Right. And there were more black or...
Yeah, no, thank goodness that we know. And to this day, when I walk into my classes and see black students and white students together and they take it for granted, to me it's still a miracle. Because when I was growing up, I thought it would be segregation forever. But I think literature has played a tremendous role in fighting, in creating more racial understanding, whether it's Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, or James Baldwin, or Lucille Clifton, or Toni Morrison. I mean, these are tremendously important books, and so when we can assign these books to our kids, our students, you can see them grappling with these foundational questions. But some parents would just assume they not grapple with them.
They should be grappling with.
And suddenly they're teachers and parents.
So books do sometimes, as you say in the title, change history. I mean, they do have a major influence and impact. For sure.
I absolutely think so.
And your book, Better Living Through Literature, I think it started as a blog, right?
Yes.
Tell us something about the blog and how it's all then developed.
Way back when. It's once again, part of my teaching mission, as I see, is to bring people to literature. And I think I've written a book designed to do that, but then 2008 happened, the worldwide economic crisis. The publisher withdrew the book. So my son, who's in marketing, said, well, if you want to get your word out, you could blog.
To reach out. Outreach.
It's another way of doing it. And then people will see your blog, and then they will come to your book. Well, I started blogging, and then I said, wow, this is the greatest classroom of all.
Global classroom.
A global classroom. So it's called Better Living Through Beowulf. Beowulf, of course, stands in for all of literature, but I like the alliteration. Better Living Through Beowulf.
Right.
And so I have readers. So I write an essay every day, except for Saturday. So, I have readers. I've had readers in Uganda and Australia and Peru and all over the world.
And you were getting feedback.
And I get feedback, and they give me ideas, and sometimes I share those ideas. And so what I do is I say, okay, this is an instance of how literature has impacted my life, this person's life, a story I've heard about. So every day, some work of literature, and I focus on poems, stories, and plays. I kind of focus on those 3 genres, and I'm just looking constantly for instances of where literature, a classic will show up in the news. I'll see some politician using a work of literature or something like that. And I figured if I just keep on sending out these essays, I will convince people that literature is central to our lives and not just some frivolous activity we do on the side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this additional explanation of the genesis of your book. Actually, it all, I guess, some of these, some of this feedback or some of your thoughts are included in this book. Then.
Yeah. No, I worked through many of my ideas in the blog, and then I just started taking things out of the blog. And
right. But you have transformed it, and you added things, and you contextualized.
Of course. One thing the blog was very useful too. I mean, I would talk. I was teaching my classes, and my students would tell me, how they were using Beowulf or Twelfth Night or in their own lives, and I would always get their permission. But with their permission, I would tell their stories in my blog. Sometimes with their names. Sometimes they say you can do it, but keep me anonymous. But anyway, the blog became a way, kind of a collection place where I could have all these stories. So when I sat down to write this book, I just read through my blog and just pulled out a lot of stories, that I'd already described in the blog.
I see. Thank you. Now, the title is Better Living Through Literature, but does your book, I think it does actually, if I may kind of anticipate a bit. So, transcend literature and enter, you can apply these issues into the sphere of television and film. And so, would you agree?
Yeah, it's
to what extent is this
right.
fact?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, every age has, first of all, in almost every age, you've seen some form of literature get attacked. Well, you'd see thinkers who would elevate a certain form of literature, and then often that same form of literature would get attacked. So for the ancient Greeks, the Epic of Homer, but even more the drama of Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles.
Sophocles, yeah.
Let's see, in the drama was major in Shakespeare's time. The novel was seen as very dangerous in the 18th century. And that, so it's actually every century. And Romanticism. The lyric poetry. So I get to the 20th century, in the 21st century, and then suddenly it explodes because, of course, there's cinema, there's television. There are video games. People become immersed in the narratives of video games. Indeed. And I said, so do I include film in my book? Do I include television in my book? And suddenly it was just too big. I had to limit it a little bit. So I said, but what I say about the power of immersion in fiction and fictional identification applies to film, to television
and games.
And games as well. Comic books. There's whenever you have, and by the way, all of these have been attacked. Television has been attacked. Comic books have been attacked. Video games are constantly being attacked. Whenever you have, a reader or an audience lose themselves in a fictional universe, their parents get nervous. Society gets nervous. But they, on the other hand, are feeling something very meaningful is happening. And so often where the battles happen. Just to give you, here's an example. You asked me about television and film. I just want to use it. So when the Harry Potter books came out, parents would see their 10-year-old, 11-year-old children buy books that were this thick at midnight.
That never happened before.
It never happened. And then they would stay up all night. So the parents would see their children disappear into the Potterverse, they would call it. The
Really?
The universe Potterverse, right? And it made them it said, what are they doing? They have lives apart from us. And some parents found this very threatening. But it's not only kids. Just here's another example. In the 18th century, there was Samuel Richardson wrote Clarissa. It's a novel which is written in letters, which is 1,000,000 words long. Husbands would see their wives disappear into the pages of Clarissa. It's like suddenly nobody was minding the servants, nobody was bringing their supper because their wives were off in their little rooms. Their rooms were called closets in those days.
Right.
They had disappeared into the pages, and so there were all these attacks on novels in the 18th century because this new form was doing things to people's minds that people had never seen before.
Right.
And when that happens, the censors get to work.
Got to work, yeah. And actually, this is connecting with this issue of, or question maybe, whether literature can be good but also bad for you.
Yeah, that's a good question.
We were talking, you remember, we were talking the other day about Madame Bovary, whose life has been radically changed and not for the better, actually.
That's right, yeah.
By reading these...
Paul and Virginia. Paul Yvette, she reads these popular romances, right. And they spoil her marriage, right?
So good or bad? I mean,
well, it's interesting. So on one hand, it's like, well, good for whom? For the Somali authorities who imprisoned, Baroud, Anna Karenina is bad for you because it makes you think for yourself, right? But if you have any kind of sense of progress or kind of enlightened values, so the line I usually draw is between there's literature which is just emotional and literature which combines the emotions with the intellect. So the literature that Emma Bovary is reading is bad literature, sentimental. She's on a little island and she's got this little black boy who's catering. That's happening in the novel. And she's dreaming, she says, this is what love is, but it's a very superficial vision of love. There's not a higher spiritual vision. So I think, and we have lots of books that do that, who just, they kind of grab us emotionally, but they don't force us to think, and they don't give us a higher spiritual vision. So I think the greatest literature has always operated on the emotions, on the intellect, and on the spirit.
Both, right?
All three.
All three levels. Yeah.
But a lot of them, what is Slovenians call, trivialna literatura.
Exactly, that's what I want to do. So, of course, in trivial literature, what you have is mostly, stereotypes or predictability, of course, is an important element. So, characterization can be flat, not necessarily, but often it is. So, trivial. So you would say that this trivial trivial, popular? Would you equate that or not quite?
I do.
You do?
I do. You do? And but what I would say is, it's almost like reading. No, I don't want to stop people reading. All. There's a lot of fun in a shallow romance, just as there's a lot of fun in eating a donut.
Although it's not healthy for you. Right?
But it's, you don't want to ban donuts, right?
You don't ban donuts.
Right. So if you, it's okay to eat a donut. Just don't eat too many of them. Don't make your diet only donuts.
Exactly.
Make sure that you mix in some healthy food as well.
Right.
Yeah, I think Brecht talks about consumable literature. Literature that doesn't do anything but fill you up. It's his version of a trivialna literatura.
Okay. Speaking of stereotypes, deconstructing, constructing them, right, through literature, it does operate both ways, doesn't it? The stereotyping and othering, of course,
right?
Especially in the trivial.
Oh, there have been some very dangerous.
Can you give us some example of from some of the, let's say, authors?
Yeah, one novel that comes to mind offhand, Jean Raspail, Camp of Saints. It's all about black immigrants coming in and swarming all over Europe and all over the United States. And, it's Steve Bannon, who's a Trump supporter. He loves this book because it works on these primal fears of the other, you know, the
Yes.
other with a capital O.
Of course. Of course.
And so it just feeds. Or here's another example. In the United States, there was a novel in the early 20th century called The Klansman. And even though most people, by Thomas Dixon, most people haven't heard of The Klansman, but many people have heard of the movie that it was made into, which was Birth of a Nation.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes,
one
yes.
of the first, great movies.
Like, was it silent movies?
It was a silent movie.
It was
yeah,
a silent movie. But,
Yeah, 1915.
Right.
But boy, I mean, but it just, the KKK, you know, this white terrorist organization in the United States, it became a recruitment film. It basically, both the novel and then the movie fed fed racism, and it saw blacks as either, well, the good blacks know their place, the bad blacks will try to rape white women.
Mm-hmm.
And but it was a very powerful novel, and it was a best-selling novel. It was, for the longest time, it was the best, the highest grossing movie of all time by $1915. So yeah, I would say that's an instance of very dangerous mimesis, very dangerous.
And stereotypes.
Stereotypes, right.
Yeah, for sure.
But those films do not ever rise to the level of thought, or I mean, well, it's a shallow type of thinking, but they don't acknowledge the full humanity of the characters. I mean, if you want to contrast, I mean, this is an obvious contrast, but you take a playwright like Shakespeare. Shakespeare gives all of his characters, even minor characters, 3 dimensions, full humanity. When you encounter even the Jew in the Jewish moneylender in Merchant of Venice, he has a full humanity. If you prick me, do I not bleed? That's what great literature does. You can't stay in a shallow stereotype when you're in the presence of great literature.
Exactly.
But in popular literature, you can.
You can, yeah. And I mean, also, like in his case, in the case of Shakespeare, right? His plays usually really most of them or all of them, they operate on the level of, personal, private, domestic level, but also, of course, social. So they're all really complex.
Yeah,
that's the beauty of, that's art actually also.
One of the thinkers I feature in my book is Harold Bloom.
Yes.
And Harold Bloom said, here's a case of literature changing history, not just an individual life, but history itself. Harold Bloom says, before Shakespeare, we didn't have interiority. Shakespeare, it's almost like Shakespeare comes along and suddenly the world goes from black and white to color. Suddenly people have personality. Suddenly people have depth that they didn't have before.
Shades of gray.
Shades of gray, absolutely. It's like he came in and suddenly you couldn't see the world the same way again. He just changed the landscape in a way that it's almost like we couldn't, well, I guess people can go back, because people can always go back to seeing things in black and white. But in a Shakespeare play, you see the full humanity of its characters. And it's,
Okay. And now, I think a very relevant question for you. Now, how much is your book, your texts, your analysis, how much are they influenced by your own personal experiences?
Okay.
Right? So personal views and experiences of life or in life.
You mean what books have?
Well, yeah, and also why have you chosen these books? Yeah, why these books? Why have you chosen these books? And have they had major influence? Well, you have mentioned one or two.
Oh yeah, I was a child.
But your personal life, is it reflected in any of these books and the selection of these books? That's what I'm...
That's good. It's interesting. I sometimes will give to my students, I will, when I used to teach a course called Theories of the Reader, in which basically I was teaching a version of my book, and I would have them write a reading history, and I would say, take 3 books that have been important to you, and then figure out who you were that explains why you had the response that you did. You know, and I'm looking at ways in which these books had changed their lives. But I said, limit yourself to 3 books because I really wanted to. So I did this assignment for myself, and next thing I know, I had like 30, 40 books. I mean, there are so many. It's almost like, depending on what day you ask me, I'll come up with different books. But I must say that books like, or like a short story like Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, or The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, just changed the way I saw race relations. Huckleberry Finn helped, but I really needed to be reading books by black authors to realize just what a rich world lay waiting for us if we were able to step beyond our racial stereotypes and open ourselves up to the complexity of other people. So
you dwell quite, well, not a lot, I mean, you dedicate a substantial part of the book to Jane Eyre also.
Oh yes.
I think you have to tell us something about
I know.
Jane Eyre and its afterlives.
Right, no, I love
its afterlives.
And it's interesting because Jane Eyre, it's almost like there are kind of 2 moments in Jane Eyre's history where it had an impact. It had a huge impact when it came out. It came out in 1847, and at the time you had this new class of women, governesses. They were from the gentry class, but suddenly we were moving from landed gentry to industrialization, and so you had these very intelligent women, educated women who couldn't find jobs, and they didn't have money, so they couldn't get married. And so what was the position you could do? Well, it was you could become a governess, but and so 2 of the 3 Bronte sisters wrote governess novels. Anne Bronte wrote a governess novel as well, and so you had these very smart women who couldn't get married, so they weren't feeling right. And then they read Jane Eyre, and suddenly they see their lives there, and they feel they feel strong enough.
Empowered.
Empowered.
Yes.
Yeah, and I know I actually have, and I include this in my book. My great grandmother read Jane Eyre, and that gave her the courage to leave her home and become a governess. But then 150 years later, you had the feminist movement. And Jane Eyre provided the feminist movement with one of its most powerful images, which is the mad woman in the attic. So basically, you weren't supposed to be angry if you're a woman because anger is threatening. So this kind of but what the Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, the authors of this study, said, you may look like you're a nice, decent woman right here, but up here you have this mad woman, and you have, and it's so 19 feminists were able to get in touch with anger, which they had been denying that they had, because you weren't supposed to be angry. And this, so, like Jane Eyre, this 150-year-old book, gave them a language for dealing with emotions that they had been keeping under.
Yes, and then of course, then after the Second World War, it was Jean Rhys who kind of rewrote.
Right, that's right. That's the book you teach in your Anglophone literature class, and I know. Yes, so on the one hand, you had these. In the early days, feminism was a white woman's movement, at least in the United States, and then they started reading Jean Rhys's account of the mad woman in the attic, and said, just a minute. Bronte turns her into kind of a stereotype, the angry, the crazy Cajun woman. But Jean Rhys comes in, from Antigua, right, and gives her a history, gives her a story. Right. And so suddenly, white feminists are saying, just a minute, we haven't even paid any attention to women of color. So a book like Jean Rhys almost gave an opening for women of color to become more involved in the feminist movement. And I remember Gloria Steinem saying, this was in 1972, she came to my college, and she said, we white women tried to kind of claim the whole movement for ourselves, and we need to create alliances with a whole different set of women.
Okay, thank you. Maybe now we're moving towards the end.
Okay.
So, a question, you do mention quite a few critical thinkers, theoreticians. Are there any Slovenian critics or writers, maybe even, who have influenced your thinking, your work, your book?
Probably the most influential has been Mladen Dolar, right? In the Mladen and I met maybe 2 or 3 weeks in 1987, very, very early in my first Fulbright here, when you were still Yugoslavia. And he's been tremendously influential. He's got a tremendous grasp of the intersection between philosophy and literature. He understands Plato at levels which I find dazzling. This whole Plato's exploration of mimesis. So Mladen's been very important. My colleagues in the English department, who have, including you, have opened my eyes to the ways in which Slovenian authors have been instrumental, have changed the history of Slovenia. So when I first came here, I was thinking, wow, what kind of, I didn't know anything about Slovenia. I ended up here.
This was 87.
1987.
Right?
We were still Yugoslavia, and then I remember. In fact, I remember talking to you about this. I said, wow, you name all your streets after poets. You've got Prešeren, you've got in the central square, you've got Vodnik, this kind of statue over here. I keep on, you have Tsonkare Dome, named after me, Ivan Tsonkar. Early on I read Samo Rasniki, by Vorons, and then later on I would go on and read, Andreja Blatnik and Drago Jančar, those books, in translation, and I would see, and so what I understood in a powerful way is that literature, it's not just at the edges of Slovenian society.
Right.
It's absolutely central to your identity.
Exactly.
Prešeren and Vodnik's, contributions to making. If a language can produce a great literature, then that almost like justifies having a nation to go along with it.
All right. Well put.
Yeah, I know that Ukraine. That's why Sakharov. Why is I think that's his name. It's so vital because he said Ukraine is not just a part of Russia because Ukrainian is capable of producing great literature. So I came to realize that the importance of literature is so central to the Slovenian identity.
Very, to the cultural and national and so on.
Right.
All these levels of identity, actually, which is of course. Okay, Professor Bates, Robin, thank you very much for these very interesting answers, and I'm sure that they will elicit the viewers from the academia as well as from the interested, public to get hold of a book, of your book, which is available now online also and so on. So just allow me to say that enjoy the rest of your stay in Slovenia now that you're here, and hopefully until next time.
Thank you. I feel so honored that you keep on inviting me back. So thank you for that.
Thank you.